The plains of North Dakota stretched endless under a sky the color of old pewter November wind, carrying the bite of winter yet to come. Catherine Webb stood at her kitchen window, watching two children play in the yard behind a wall of stone that curved like a sleeping serpent around the north side of her cabin. Lucas chased his sister through patches of brown grass, both of them wearing only light wool sweaters, despite the thermometer nailed to the porch post reading 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Across the fence line, she could see Gunnar Erickson trudging from his barn to his house, shoulders hunched against the cold, his breath visible in thick clouds. His children would be huddled near the stove inside wrapped in quilts, even though the sun hadn't set. 6 months earlier, none of this had existed. No wall, no warmth, no certainty that she and her children would survive the coming winter. The memory arrived sharp as broken glass, Eric's body carried out of the copper mine on a plank, his face peaceful in a way that made the violence of his death seem like a cruel joke. A support beam had given way in the number 7 shaft. 3 men crushed. Eric Webb, 34 years old, had left behind a widow, 2 children, 40 acres of stubborn North Dakota soil, and a leather journal filled with sketches that most people would have dismissed as the idle dreams of a laborer with ideas above his station. Catherine had opened that journal the night after the funeral, sitting at the kitchen table while Lucas and Ingrid slept in the loft. The pages were covered in careful diagrams, measurements written in Eric's neat hand, annotations in a mixture of English and what she assumed was German, sketches of stone walls, calculations of wind velocity and thermal mass, cross-sections showing airflow patterns that looked more like the work of an engineer than a miner. On the final page, Eric had written a message in ink that looked fresher than the rest, as though he'd added it recently. If I don't finish this, find Johann Schmidt in Fargo. He'll understand. Don't let them take what's ours. 3 days later, Harold Peterson had arrived at her door. Peterson owned the only general store within 20 miles and held a minor appointed position in the county land office, a combination that gave him more power over the settlers' lives than any elected official. He was a thick man with pale eyes and hands that looked soft despite the frontier, setting the kind of man who had found ways to profit from other people's labor without ever blistering his own palms. He'd stood on her porch, hat in hand expression, arranged in what he probably thought was sympathetic concern. Mrs. Webb, I know this is a difficult time. I want you to know the community is here to support you. Catherine had learned young that when men opened with reassurances, a trap usually followed. I'm managing, Mr. Peterson. Thank you for your concern. His smile had tightened at the edges. The thing is, a woman alone with 2 small children, winter coming on, it's not really managing, is it? It's surviving at best. Now I've been thinking, that 40 acres of yours, it's good land, not great. Mind you, but serviceable. I'd be willing to take it off your hands for a fair price. Give you enough to relocate somewhere more suitable, Fargo maybe, or even back east where you've got family. She'd kept her voice level. I have no family back east, Mr. Peterson, and I'm not selling. The sympathy had evaporated from his face like morning dew under a harsh sun. Be reasonable, Mrs. Webb. You can't work this land alone. You've got no husband, no hired men. Winter's going to hit hard this year if the signs are right. What happens when you run out of firewood in February? When your supplies run low and you need credit at my store, I'm offering you a way out before things get desperate. She'd closed the door in his face. That night, she'd opened Eric's journal again, studying the sketches with new urgency. The wall he'd designed wasn't decorative. Every line had purpose. The curve calculated to redirect prevailing winter winds. The height determined by the angle needed to create a sheltered zone. The thickness required for thermal mass. Eric had been planning this for months, maybe years, gathering stones from the fields and creek beds, stockpiling them behind the barn. Catherine had attended 2 years of normal school before her parents died, enough education to be unusual for a woman on the frontier. She could read technical diagrams. She understood basic mathematics. What she didn't understand was whether she had the physical strength to turn Eric's plans into reality. The next morning, she'd walked out to the pile of stones behind the barn. 200 of them, maybe more, each one weighing between 20 and 60 pounds. Eric had sorted them by type dark granite, pale sandstone chunks of quartzite that glittered in the sunlight. Next to the pile sat 3 wooden buckets filled with a grayish powder that smelled of lime and several burlap sacks of clay dug from the creek bank. Lucas had followed her out small for his 8 years, but wiry and persistent. "Mama, what are all these rocks for?" She'd picked up one of the smaller stones, feeling its weight, its rough surface against her palms. "Your father was going to build something important. Can we build it instead?" The question had hung in the cold October air. Catherine set the stone down carefully, looking at the sketches she'd brought with her, then at the north wall of the cabin where Eric had planned to begin. "Yes, we can." The first attempt had been a disaster. She'd mixed the mortar according to Eric's notes, combining lime clay and wood ash in what she thought were the right proportions, adding water until it formed a thick paste. The consistency looked right. She laid out the foundation line using string and stakes to mark the curve Eric had drawn. The first row of stones went down smoothly, each one bedded in mortar level, checked with a carpenter's tool Eric had left in the barn. By sunset, she'd completed 3 feet of wall, 18 inches high. Lucas and Ingrid had helped carry smaller stones, their faces flushed with pride. Catherine had allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. The next morning, she'd found the entire section, collapsed stones, scattered mortar, crumbled to powder. She'd stood, staring at the rubble for a long time, fighting the urge to simply walk away. This was impossible. She'd been foolish to think otherwise. A woman with 2 years of schooling couldn't master in days what Eric had learned over years from trained stonemasons. Ingrid had tugged at her skirt. "Mama, why did it fall down?" Catherine had knelt beside her daughter, picking up a piece of the failed mortar. It crumbled between her fingers, too dry, the mixture wrong. "Because I made a mistake. But that's all right. Mistakes are how we learn." She had spent 2 days rereading Eric's notes, studying the mortar recipe more carefully. The proportions weren't simple ratios. They varied based on temperature, humidity, the porosity of the stones being used. Eric had included weather observations in his journal, correlating them with different mixture formulas. She'd been treating it like a simple recipe when it was actually a complex chemical process that required adjustment and judgment. The second attempt lasted 3 days before developing cracks. The third attempt held. By mid-November, she'd completed 15 feet of wall running from the northwest corner of the cabin in a gentle eastward curve. The structure stood 6 feet high, built from carefully selected stones with the densest granite, forming the bulk of the mass lighter sandstone used strategically for breathability. The mortar between them was the pale gray of river clay mixed with lime, hard as concrete where it had cured properly. The work had transformed her. Her hands developed calluses thick as boot leather. Her shoulders broadened from lifting stone. She learned to read the weight of a rock by sight to judge the exact amount of mortar needed to feel when a stone was properly seated. Lucas became adept at mixing mortar to her specifications. Ingrid's job was quality control, checking that each course remained level. The neighbors noticed. Gunnar Eriksson had been the most vocal in his skepticism. He was a man who'd emigrated from Norway with firm ideas about the proper roles of men and women. Ideas that didn't include widows engaging in heavy construction. He'd stopped his wagon on the road one afternoon, watching Catherine wrestle a 40-pound stone into position. His voice had carried across the yard, pitched loud enough that his wife Astrid could hear from the wagon seat. "Look at this. Building castles like some medieval queen while winter's coming. Should be putting up preserves, preparing for the cold like a sensible woman." Astrid had adjusted her shawl, her expression tight with the particular discomfort of someone who halfway agreed but knew better than to say so. Eric always was strange with his ideas. Now she's carrying on with his foolishness. Catherine had set the stone carefully before turning to face them. "Good afternoon, Mr. Eriksson, Mrs. Eriksson. Cold day to be out." Gunnar had shifted on the wagon seat, perhaps expecting anger or shame, finding neither. "You'd do better finding a new husband than playing with rocks. A woman alone isn't going to make it through a North Dakota winter." She'd smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. "I appreciate your concern. I'll be sure to let you know if I need advice on how to manage my own property. The wagon had rolled on, but she'd heard Gunner's voice drifting back. Pride goes before a fall. Mark my words. The criticism had stung more than she'd wanted to admit, not because she doubted her course, but because the entire settlement was watching, waiting for her to fail. She was an example of something, though. She wasn't sure what the foolishness of women who exceeded their proper station or the arrogance of newcomers who thought they could outsmart the brutal Dakota climate with fancy ideas. The worst moment had come at church. Catherine attended services every Sunday, partly from genuine faith, partly because absence would have marked her as even more of an outsider. The small Lutheran church served as the settlement's social hub, the one place where scattered homesteaders gathered weekly to share news and gossip. She'd arrived that Sunday in late November to find the usual cluster of men outside the building, breath steaming in the cold as they discussed weather and crops. The conversation had stopped when she approached with Lucas and Ingrid. Pastor Johansson had greeted her warmly enough, but Gunnar had been standing close enough to make being overheard inevitable. I give her until February. Then she'll be begging someone to take her in. Probably Peterson will get the land for half what it's worth. Nils Bergman had laughed the sound carrying. Assuming the bank doesn't foreclose first, building rock walls when she should be stacking firewood. I've never seen such foolishness. Catherine had kept walking head high, herding her children into the church. But Ingrid had heard. That night, getting ready for bed, the little girl had asked, "Mama, are we going to lose our house?" Catherine had pulled her daughter close, feeling the fragility of small bones, the trust of a child who didn't yet understand how precarious their situation truly was. "No, sweetheart. We're going to be fine. Better than fine." She'd spoken with more confidence than she felt. By the first week of December, the wall had reached its planned length of 32 feet, curving from the cabin's northwest corner in a smooth arc that terminated near the barn. The structure formed a rough C shape open to the south, where summer breezes would need to pass, sealed to the north against the prevailing winter winds that screamed down from Canada with nothing to stop them across hundreds of miles of flat prairie. Catherine stood back to survey the finished structure. 6 feet of stacked stone, 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly toward the top. Small gaps had been left near the foundation, no larger than a fist, positioned according to Eric's careful specifications. The top of the wall had been sealed with a final layer of mortar, creating a smooth cap that would shed rain and snow. It looked solid, permanent, like something that might have stood for 100 years rather than 6 weeks. Whether it would actually work remained to be seen. The first snow came that night. Catherine woke to the whisper of wind against the cabin walls, a sound that usually meant the temperature had dropped below freezing. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the children, and went to the window. Fat flakes drifted down in the darkness, visible only where they passed through the yellow square of lamplight from her window. The wind was picking up, coming from the northwest as it always did, and she could see the snow beginning to swirl and dance. By dawn, 3 inches had accumulated. By noon, 6. Catherine bundled the children and made her way outside to check on the livestock. The chickens were huddled in their coop, the milk cow lowing softly in the barn. Everything seemed secure. She'd spent October gathering every scrap of firewood she could find, splitting logs until her arms ached, stacking the wood in covered rows along the cabin's south wall. The interesting thing was the snow distribution. On the north side of the wall, snow had piled in deep drifts, sculpted by the wind into smooth curves. But in the space between the wall and the cabin, in that sheltered C-shaped zone Eric's design had created, the snow lay in an even blanket barely 4 inches deep. The wind passed overhead. She could see that clearly, now forced up and over the wall's 6-foot height, the bulk of its force directed away from the structure it was meant to protect. Lucas came outside, stopping in his tracks when he saw the difference. "Mama, look, the snow is different on this side." Catherine nodded, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight since Eric's death. "Your father knew what he was doing." The real test came 3 weeks later. Harold Peterson's buggy appeared on the road just after lunch, moving at the careful pace of a man who didn't want to seem hurried but had business to conduct. He'd brought someone with him, a thin man in a city coat who carried a leather satchel. Catherine met them at the door before they could knock. Peterson's smile was all professional courtesy, empty as a banker's promise. "Mrs. Webb, I hope we're not intruding. This is Mr. Francis Carter from the county surveyor's office. We need to discuss a matter of some importance." Carter pulled papers from his satchel, his movements fussy and precise. "Mrs. Webb, it's come to our attention that you've erected a substantial structure on your property without the proper permits. County ordinance requires that any building over 4 feet in height and 10 feet in length be registered with the land office and inspected for compliance with building codes." Catherine looked at the papers he was offering. Legal language, dense and threatening, with phrases like unlawful construction and immediate remediation required. She didn't take them. "That wall was designed by my husband, who learned masonry from a trained professional. It's on my own property, not encroaching on any right-of-way or neighboring land." Peterson stepped forward, his voice taking on a practiced reasonableness. "No one's questioning your husband's intentions, God rest his soul. But the fact remains this construction wasn't approved. Now we can handle this the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is you agree to remove the structure by the first of the year. The hard way involves the county taking legal action, which could result in forced sale of the property to cover fines and penalties." The threat was clear. Remove the wall or lose everything. Catherine felt rage bloom hot in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "And I suppose you'd be willing to buy the property at a generous price to save me from these legal troubles." Carter looked uncomfortable. Peterson didn't blink. "I'm a businessman, Mrs. Webb. If the county forced a sale, I'd certainly submit a fair bid. But it doesn't have to come to that. Be reasonable." She stepped back, starting to close the door. "I'll be speaking with a lawyer about this. Good day, gentlemen." Peterson's hand shot out, stopping the door. His mask of courtesy had cracked. "You have until December 31st. After that, the county will take action. And let me give you some free advice. Winters here are hard on people who don't have friends. You might want to think about that before you make this difficult." The threat wasn't subtle. Peterson controlled the only store. If he refused to extend credit, refused to sell supplies, Catherine would have no way to feed her children through the winter. She met his eyes, saw the calculation there, the certainty that he'd won because he always won. Men like Peterson understood leverage. They knew exactly how much pressure a person could take before breaking. "Get off my property." He'd stepped back, smiling like he had already received the answer he wanted. The buggy had rolled away, leaving Catherine standing in the doorway, the legal papers crumpled in her fist. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the table with Eric's journal open in front of her and the threatening legal documents spread beside it. The math was brutal. She had enough savings to last until March if she was careful. But that assumed she could buy supplies. If Peterson cut her off from credit and refused cash sales, her reserves wouldn't matter. She'd starve with money in her pocket. The alternative was surrender. Sell the land, take whatever Peterson offered, pack up the children and leave. Find some city where she could work as a seamstress or laundress, raise Lucas and Ingrid in a tenement where they'd never have space to run or clean air to breathe. It would be safe, sensible, the choice any reasonable widow would make. She looked at the journal, at Eric's careful handwriting, his precise diagrams. He'd believed in this. Believed enough to spend months gathering stones, learning techniques, preparing for a project he wouldn't live to complete. The last page stared at her. "Find Johann Schmidt in Fargo. He'll understand." Catherine pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero on Christmas Eve. Catherine had never experienced cold like this. It wasn't simply the absence of warmth. It was an active presence, a physical force that pressed against the walls and sought every gap and crack. She'd stuffed rags into the spaces around the windows and door-hung blankets over the walls for extra insulation, kept the stove burning constantly. The interior temperature held at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Lucas and Ingrid played near the stove, warm enough in their wool clothes. Catherine had made them new sweaters from yarn she'd traded eggs for, and they wore them with the casual comfort of children who didn't realize other people might be suffering. 2 days after Christmas, Gunnar Ericsson's wife appeared at the door. Astrid looked haggard, her face pinched with cold, despite the heavy coat and shawl. "Mrs. Webb, I hope I'm not intruding." Catherine stepped back, gesturing her inside. "Not at all. Please come warm yourself." Astrid entered slowly, her eyes widening as the relative warmth of the cabin hit her. She looked around, taking in the children playing in their light sweaters, the lack of frost on the windows, the single blanket on the bed rather than the pile of quilts most families needed. "It's warm in here." Catherine poured coffee from the pot that stayed perpetually on the stove. "The wall helps." Astrid took the cup, wrapping her hands around it like it was precious. "Our house is 42 degrees inside. The children are sick. Nothing serious, just colds, but they can't seem to shake them. Gunnar's burning through our wood supply twice as fast as he planned." She didn't say the next part, but Catherine heard it anyway. They'd been wrong, all of them. The men who'd mocked her, the women who'd whispered about inappropriate behavior and doomed foolishness. They'd all been catastrophically wrong. "I'm sorry the children are unwell. If there's anything I can do." Astrid set the cup down with a sharp click. "Gunnar won't ask. He's too proud, but I'm not. That wall, could something like that work for other houses?" The question hung in the air between them. Catherine thought about Peterson's ultimatum, the legal papers demanding she tear down the very structure that was saving her children's lives. She thought about the settlement closing ranks against her, about being marked as a troublemaker, about the price of helping people who'd done nothing to help her. Then she thought about children huddled under piles of blankets, unable to stay warm. About families burning through winter fuel by January, facing February and March with nothing left. Yes, it would work for any house as long as it's built correctly, but the design has to be specific to each property. Wind direction, building orientation, available materials, all of it matters. Astrid's eyes had filled with tears. Could you teach us?" Before Catherine could answer, the sound of a wagon on the frozen road drew their attention. Both women went to the window. A sturdy freight wagon was pulling up to the cabin, driven by a man Catherine didn't recognize. He was old, maybe 70, with a face weathered to leather and hands that moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with tools. He climbed down from the wagon seat, moving stiffly in the cold, and walked to the door. Catherine opened it before he could knock. The old man's eyes were sharp and blue beneath shaggy white eyebrows. "You're Catherine Webb." "I am." "Johann Schmidt. Got your letter 3 weeks ago. Took me a while to arrange things so I could make the trip." His accent was faint but present, German roots showing through American English. "You wrote that Eric is dead." Catherine nodded, throat tight. 3 months ago, mining accident." Schmidt's face didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a grief too deep for outward expression. "He was a good student, best I ever taught. I'm sorry for your loss." He looked past her, his gaze taking in the children, the warm cabin, then moving to the window where the stone wall was visible through the glass. "You built Eric's wall." "Yes." Schmidt walked past her without asking permission. Moving to the window, studying the structure with the intense focus of a master craftsman examining another's work. He stood there for a long time, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Finally, he turned to face her. "You've made mistakes. The western curve is too shallow by about 8 degrees. You've used too much sandstone in the lower courses where you need maximum density, and your mortar mix is inconsistent. I can see variations in color that indicate different hydration levels between batches." Catherine felt her face flush. She'd worked for weeks, pushed herself to the edge of exhaustion, and this old man had spotted her failures in under a minute. Schmidt's stern expression cracked into something that might have been a smile. "But overall, it's good work. Better than good. Eric would be proud. And I suspect you learned all of this from his journal with no teacher, which makes it even more impressive." He moved to the table, pulling out Eric's journal with the familiarity of someone who had seen it many times before. "Did he tell you about the thermal circulation system?" Catherine shook her head. I saw diagrams but didn't fully understand them. Schmidt flipped pages until he found a detailed cross-section. The wall doesn't just block wind, the stones absorb solar radiation during the day, even weak winter sun, and release it at night. But Eric designed something more sophisticated. See these small openings near the base. They're not random, they're positioned to create convection currents. Cold air near the ground flows through the gaps, gets warmed by the stone mass, rises, and creates a gentle circulation of warmer air around the protected zone. It's an ancient technique used in some European fortifications, but adapted for domestic architecture. He pointed to measurements in the margins. Your wall is doing this already, but you could enhance the effect by enlarging 3 of the lower vents and adding a reflecting surface behind the wall to increase solar gain. You'd gain another 4 or 5 degrees of temperature stability. Catherine stared at the diagram, seeing now what she'd missed before. Eric hadn't just designed a windbreak. He'd created a passive heating system that used the sun's stone and physics to moderate temperature without burning a single piece of wood. Astrid had been listening from across the room. Could this work for other houses? Schmidt looked at her, then at Catherine. It can work for any structure if properly designed, but it requires understanding the specific conditions of each site: wind patterns, solar exposure, building orientation, soil composition. It's not something you can just copy. Catherine made a decision. Could you stay? Teach us the settlement needs this. People are burning through their fuel supply. Children are getting sick. If we don't do something, families won't make it to spring. The old man studied her face for a long moment. I can stay 2 months, maybe 3. After that, my own farm needs attention, but I can teach you enough that you could continue without me. The question is, will people listen? You're a woman, I'm a foreigner. This settlement doesn't strike me as particularly open-minded. Catherine thought about Gunnar's mockery, about Peterson's threats, about the whispers at church. Then she thought about Astrid's desperation, about children huddled under insufficient blankets, about the long weeks of winter still ahead. They'll listen, because the alternative is freezing. Schmidt nodded slowly. Then we'd better start. Winter doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. The next Sunday, Catherine stood outside the church after services waiting as families emerged into the brittle cold. Gunnar appeared with his wife and 3 children, all of them bundled in layers of wool and fur that still didn't seem adequate. His face tightened when he saw Catherine waiting. She stepped forward before he could walk past. Mr. Erickson, I'd like to speak with you about a business proposition. Gunnar's eyebrows rose. Business. Your wife mentioned your children have been ill, that your fuel consumption is higher than anticipated. I believe I can help with that if you are willing to listen. She saw the war on his face: pride, fighting against pragmatism, masculine certainty battling the evidence of his own freezing house. Other families had stopped listening because word had spread about the warmth of the Webb cabin, about Catherine's wall that seemed to defy the physics of Dakota winter. Gunnar's voice came out stiff. What kind of help? I have someone staying with me, a master stonemason who taught my husband. He's willing to teach anyone in the settlement how to build proper thermal walls. No charge for the instruction. You'd only need to provide your own materials and labor. Niels Bergman had stopped nearby, his expression skeptical. And why would you do that out of the goodness of your heart? Catherine met his gaze steadily. Because I don't want to watch children suffer through a winter that doesn't have to be this hard. And because when spring comes, the settlement needs to be strong, not broken. We're all fighting the same enemy, and it's not each other. Pastor Johansson stepped forward, his round face thoughtful. This is a generous offer, Mrs. Webb, though I confess I'm curious about the catch. No catch. Just one condition: anyone who accepts the help has to agree not to sell their property to Harold Peterson for 10 years. We build a community here, or we build nothing. Silence fell across the churchyard. Everyone knew what she was really saying. Peterson had been circling the struggling families like a vulture waiting for desperation to drive prices down. If enough people held out, his scheme failed. Gunnar looked at his wife, at his shivering children, then back at Catherine. The words clearly cost him something, but he forced them out. I'll listen to what your stonemason has to say. Within the hour, 5 families had agreed to the same. By mid-January, 3 more walls were under construction across the settlement, each one adapted to its specific site. Schmidt worked with each family, teaching them to read wind patterns, select appropriate stones, mix mortar that would cure properly in sub-freezing temperatures. Catherine assisted and found herself becoming a teacher as well, explaining thermal mass and convection to farmers who'd never thought about the physics of heat transfer. Lucas and Ingrid became unofficial apprentices, showing other children how to sort stones by density, how to check level, how to mix mortar to the right consistency. The work transformed the settlement's social structure. Women and children contributed equally to the construction because the work required precision more than brute strength. Harold Peterson watched it all from his store, his expression growing darker with each passing day. The legal deadline of December 31st had come and gone. Catherine had received no further official communications, but she knew the silence was temporary. Peterson was waiting, calculating, looking for a new angle of attack. It came on a Thursday afternoon in late January. Francis Carter, the county surveyor, appeared at her door again, this time with 2 large men Catherine didn't recognize. They wore deputy badges, though she'd never seen them at any official county function. Carter's voice was clipped official. Mrs. Webb, I have a court order authorizing the immediate removal of unlawful structures on this property. These men are here to carry out that order. Catherine stepped onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her. Schmidt appeared from the barn, moving to stand beside her. Several neighbors who'd been working on Gunner's wall saw the commotion and began walking over. That wall was built on private property with private resources. You have no authority here. One of the deputies stepped forward, his hand resting on the club at his belt. The county has authority anywhere there's a violation of building codes. Now step aside, ma'am. We've got work to do. Schmidt's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. You'll do no such thing. That structure is sound and poses no danger to anyone. This is harassment, not law enforcement. The deputy's face darkened. And who are you, old man? Johann Schmidt, master stonemason, licensed in 3 states, including this one. I've inspected that wall thoroughly. It exceeds all structural requirements. If your county has issues with it, they can file a formal complaint, and I'll respond with a full engineering report. Until then, you're trespassing. Carter pulled more papers from his satchel. I have authorization. From Harold Peterson, I'd wager. Schmidt's voice carried across the yard. Who stands to profit from forcing Mrs. Webb to sell? That's not law, that's corruption. By now, Gunner Nils and several other men from the settlement had arrived along with their wives and older children. They formed a rough semicircle around the cabin, not threatening but present witnesses to whatever was about to happen. The deputies looked at each other, then at the growing crowd. Whatever they'd been paid, it apparently wasn't enough to risk a confrontation with 15 angry farmers who'd been working together for weeks. Carter tried once more. This isn't over. The county can send proper officials through proper channels. Pastor Johansson had arrived, his voice carrying the moral authority of his position. Until then, I suggest you gentlemen leave. We have work to do and you're interfering with it. The deputies left. Carter followed, his face tight with frustrated rage. Catherine watched the buggy disappear down the road, then turned to face the assembled neighbors. These were people who'd mocked her weeks ago, who'd predicted her failure, who'd seen her as an object of pity at best and an example of prideful folly at worst. Gunner spoke first, his voice gruff. Peterson's going to try something else. He doesn't give up. No, Catherine agreed. He doesn't. Astrid moved closer, her expression fierce. Then we don't give up either. We finish these walls. We show everyone that we're not afraid of him. Niels nodded slowly. My brother-in-law is a lawyer in Fargo. I'll write to him, see about getting proper documentation for all our structures. Make it harder for Peterson to claim they're illegal. Schmidt clasped Catherine's shoulder briefly. You've made allies. That's the first step to winning any war. That night, working by lamplight at her kitchen table, Catherine calculated fuel consumption rates. The wall had reduced her own firewood use by 68% compared to the previous winter. If the other families achieved even half that efficiency, the settlement's collective fuel reserves would last through March with room to spare. But more than that, they'd built something that couldn't be easily torn down, a network of families bound by shared knowledge and mutual benefit. Peterson could threaten one widow. He couldn't threaten an entire settlement that had learned to work together. Lucas appeared at her elbow, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom, are we going to be all right?" Catherine pulled him close, feeling the steady warmth that radiated from the wall outside, the physical manifestation of Eric's love and foresight. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be more than all right. We're going to be strong." Outside, the winter wind howled across the plains, battering against stone walls that refused to yield, creating pockets of warmth in a landscape that had always seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to challenge it. But Catherine Webb had learned that intelligence and cooperation could transform even the most hostile environment into something survivable. The real battle, she knew, was just beginning. February arrived with temperatures that made January seem merciful by comparison. The thermometer outside Catherine's cabin registered 18 degrees below zero on the morning of the 3rd, and the wind from the northwest carried a bite that could strip exposed skin in minutes. She stood at her window, watching the dawn break pale and brittle over the frozen landscape, her breath not visible in the air despite the cold outside. The interior temperature held steady at 56 degrees Fahrenheit. Johann Schmidt appeared from the small room off the kitchen where he'd been sleeping, already dressed for the day's work. His movements had grown more deliberate over the past weeks, the cold, aggravating joints that had seen 7 decades of hard use. But his eyes remained sharp and his hands steady when he worked with stone. "Today we need to talk about the real test. What happens when the temperature drops below -20 and stays there for days? That's when your wall either proves itself or fails." Catherine poured coffee, the ritual automatic, after weeks of early mornings spent planning construction projects. "The Erickson wall is nearly finished. The Bergman structure should be complete by week's end. We've taught them everything you showed me." Schmidt took the cup, wrapping gnarled fingers around its warmth. "Teaching technique is easy. Teaching judgment takes years. What concerns me is Peterson. Men like that don't accept defeat gracefully." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a rider appeared on the road shortly after breakfast. Not Peterson himself, but one of his store clerks, a nervous young man named Timothy, who looked half frozen despite his heavy coat. Catherine met him at the door. His teeth chattered as he spoke. "Mrs. Webb, I have a message from Mr. Peterson. He's calling a settlement meeting tomorrow night at the church. Says it's about community safety and legal compliance. Asked me to make sure everyone knows attendance is expected." The phrasing was careful, but the threat beneath it clear. Peterson controlled credit at the store. Expected attendance meant families who relied on his goodwill had better show up. "Tell Mr. Patterson I'll be there." Timothy nodded and rode off, hunched against the wind. Catherine watched him go, her mind already calculating Peterson's likely strategy. He'd tried direct intimidation and failed. He'd attempted legal harassment and been rebuffed. Now he was shifting to public pressure, using the church as neutral ground to turn community sentiment against the very walls that were keeping families alive. Schmidt had come to stand beside her. "He'll make you the villain somehow. Paint these walls as dangerous or illegal, claim you're leading people astray. He'll use fear. Let him try. People can feel the difference in their own homes. They know what's working." But Schmidt's expression remained troubled. Knowledge and desperation are different things. If he offers the right incentive promises, the right relief, even people who know better might choose the easier path. That afternoon, Catherine visited each of the families who'd built walls, carrying her journal with temperature readings and fuel consumption data she'd been meticulously recording. The numbers told a story more convincing than any argument. The Erickson household had reduced firewood usage by 72%. The Bergmans, whose wall was still incomplete, had already seen a 40% reduction. Pastor Johansson's modest structure, built in just 10 days with help from the whole settlement, had cut his fuel needs by half. But numbers couldn't capture everything. At the Erickson house, Astrid showed Catherine her children playing in the main room without coats, their cheeks pink with health rather than cold. The youngest, who'd been coughing constantly in December, now ran and laughed without wheezing. They're different children than they were 6 weeks ago. Stronger, happier. I don't care what Peterson says, tomorrow I'm not tearing down this wall. Gunnar had overheard coming in from checking his livestock. His pride still made direct acknowledgement difficult, but his voice carried a grudging respect. The woman's right. Whatever political games Peterson wants to play, we've got proof in our own houses that this works. Catherine left feeling more confident, but the confidence evaporated when she reached the Haugen farm. Eric Haugen met her in his yard, his expression troubled. He was a younger man, barely 30, with a wife and infant daughter. His wall was half finished, delayed by the difficulty of finding suitable stones on his property. "Mrs. Webb, I need to talk to you about tomorrow. Peterson came by this morning, made me an offer." Catherine's stomach tightened. "What kind of offer?" "Said if I spoke up at the meeting, supported his position, that these walls are dangerous and untested, he'd forgive the $30 I owe at the store. That's 3 months of credit, Mrs. Webb. I can't afford to ignore it." The admission hung between them, honest and painful. Haugen wasn't a bad man. He was a desperate one, caught between immediate financial relief and longer-term community benefit. Catherine chose her words carefully. "I understand the position you're in, but think about what happens after tomorrow. If Peterson wins, if he forces everyone to tear down their walls, where does that leave you come March? You'll still owe him money, but now you'll be burning twice as much firewood to keep your family warm. And next winter, you'll be starting from nothing again." Haugen looked at his partially completed wall at his house, where his wife and baby were presumably warmer than they'd been in weeks. "I know, but knowing and being able to afford are different things." She left without pushing further. Coercion wouldn't work, and she wouldn't stoop to Peterson's tactics. But the encounter had revealed the shape of the coming confrontation. Peterson would use debt as a weapon, offering relief to anyone willing to publicly oppose the walls. For families already stretched thin, the temptation would be nearly irresistible. That evening, she sat with Schmidt and explained what she'd learned. The old stonemason's face remained impassive as he listened, but his eyes reflected decades of experience with men who used money as leverage. "You need an ally with authority, someone Peterson can't simply outspend or intimidate, someone whose voice carries weight beyond the settlement." Catherine understood immediately who he meant. The university professor, Thomas Mitchell. She'd written to Mitchell 3 weeks earlier, sending detailed data about temperature differentials, fuel consumption rates, and construction techniques. His response had been enthusiastic, full of technical questions and requests for more information. But getting him to travel to North Dakota in February seemed unlikely at best. Schmidt pulled a telegram from his pocket, the paper already creased from being read multiple times. "I took the liberty of sending him a wire yesterday. Explained the situation. He replied this morning." Catherine unfolded the telegram, her pulse quickening as she read, "Arriving Bismarck, February 4th. Stop will proceed to New Bergen via hired transport. Stop. This data too significant to ignore. Stop Mitchell." February 4th was tomorrow, the same day as Peterson's meeting. The church was packed by 7 o'clock, every pew filled, families standing along the walls where space permitted. The interior temperature couldn't have been more than 45 degrees despite a stove burning in the corner, and people kept their coats buttoned tight. Catherine arrived with Lucas and Ingrid, taking a seat near the back where she could observe the full room. Peterson stood near the front, talking quietly with Francis Carter, and 2 men Catherine recognized as county officials from Bismarck. Their presence signaled that this wasn't just a local dispute anymore. Peterson had escalated, bringing in outside authority to legitimize his position. Pastor Johansson called the meeting to order, his voice uncertain. He was a man of God, not politics, and clearly uncomfortable with his church being used as a battlefield. "Brothers and sisters, we're here tonight to discuss matters of community safety and compliance with county regulations. Mr. Peterson has requested time to address certain concerns. Harold, the floor is yours." Peterson stood, his posture radiating confidence and civic responsibility. He dressed carefully for this, presenting himself as a concerned citizen rather than a merchant with financial interests at stake. Thank you, Pastor. I want to start by saying this isn't personal. Mrs. Webb has faced tremendous hardship, and we all sympathize with her situation. But sympathy can't override safety and law. Over the past 2 months, several families in this settlement have constructed large stone structures without proper engineering review or building permits. These walls were designed by a miner and a widow, neither of whom has formal training in structural engineering or architecture. He paused, letting that sink in. The implication was clear: amateurs playing at expertise, risking lives through ignorance. Now I've brought gentlemen from the county building department to explain the regulations these structures violate. But more than legality, I'm concerned about safety. These walls are heavy built without foundations and soil that freezes and thaws. What happens when spring comes and the ground shifts? What happens if one collapses onto a child playing nearby? Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Peterson had chosen his angle well. Fear for children transcended economic calculation. One of the county officials stood, a portly man with spectacles and an air of bureaucratic authority. I'm Robert Winters, Chief Building Inspector for Burleigh County. Mr. Peterson's concerns are legitimate. Any structure over 5 feet in height requires a permit and inspection to ensure it meets safety standards. From what I understand, none of these walls have been properly documented or reviewed. Catherine felt eyes turning toward her, measuring her response. She remained seated, keeping her expression neutral. Schmidt had taught her that timing mattered in confrontations like this. Let your opponents commit fully to their position before you reveal your counter-strategy. Winters continued, I am authorized to issue citations and demolition orders for any structure found to be in violation. Now, we're not unreasonable people. We understand this is a frontier settlement with limited resources. If families are willing to apply for retroactive permits and submit to proper inspection, we can work something out. But the alternative is forced removal and fines. Peterson stepped forward again. And because I know many families are struggling financially, I'm prepared to help. Anyone who agrees to remove these walls voluntarily, I'll forgive up to $50 in store credit. That's a significant amount of money, enough to buy supplies for the rest of winter. All you have to do is acknowledge that these structures were built improperly and need to come down. The offer rippled through the room like wind through wheat. $50 was more than most families made in 2 months. Catherine could see the calculation happening on faces throughout the congregation. Eric Haugen looked at his wife, their silent communication speaking volumes. Gunnar Erickson stood abruptly. And what about next winter? And the winter after that? You forgive our debts now, but we'll still need supplies. We'll still owe you money. All you're doing is buying our cooperation with relief that'll run out by March. Peterson's smile never wavered. I'm offering help in good faith. What you do with it is your choice. But I'm not going to subsidize structures that violate county regulations and endanger this community. Pastor Johansson looked increasingly uncomfortable. Perhaps we should hear from Mrs. Webb. This all started with her wall after all. Catherine stood, slowly aware of every eye in the room tracking her movement. She dressed simply, a dark wool dress appropriate for church, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. Nothing about her appearance suggested the revolutionary Peterson was trying to paint her as. Mr. Peterson is right that I'm not a trained engineer. Neither was my husband. But Eric learned from masters of the craft, and he designed that wall based on principles that have been proven over centuries. As for permits, I'd be happy to apply for one. In fact, I invited someone here tonight who can speak to the structural integrity and safety of these walls better than anyone in this room. She gestured toward the back door, which opened on cue to reveal Thomas Mitchell. The professor looked out of place in his city clothes and wire-rimmed spectacles, but he carried a leather satchel that suggested serious purpose. Mitchell walked to the front of the church, nodding politely to Peterson and Winters. Good evening. I'm Professor Thomas Mitchell, Mechanical Engineering Department at the University of Minnesota. Mrs. Webb has been corresponding with me for several weeks about her thermal mass wall design. When I received word about this meeting, I felt compelled to attend. Winters bristled. With all due respect, Professor, this is a matter of county building codes, not academic theory. Mitchell opened his satchel, pulling out a sheaf of papers covered in calculations and diagrams. Then let's discuss codes. I've reviewed the specifications of Mrs. Webb's wall and those built by other families in this settlement. I've also spent the past 6 hours examining them personally despite the rather inhospitable weather. What I've found is remarkable. He spread papers on the communion table, transforming the sacred space into a makeshift laboratory. These structures demonstrate sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, wind deflection, and passive solar design. The stone selection optimizes thermal mass. The curve of the walls creates Venturi effects that redirect wind flow. The small vents near the foundation generate convection currents that moderate temperature. This isn't amateur work. This is applied physics at a level I rarely see outside university engineering departments. Peterson's expression hardened. That's all very academic, Professor, but it doesn't address the legal issue of permits and inspections. Mitchell turned to face him directly. Actually, it does, because structural safety isn't about paperwork. It's about engineering principles. And these walls are over-engineered, if anything. The foundation depth exceeds what's necessary for their height. The mortar composition is superior to standard commercial mixes. The stone selection and placement demonstrate knowledge of load distribution that frankly surprises me given the builder's backgrounds. He pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. Over the past 6 hours, I've recorded temperature differentials between protected and unprotected structures. The data is conclusive. Houses with these walls maintain interior temperatures 15 to 22 degrees higher than comparable structures while consuming 60 to 70% less fuel. Do you understand what that means economically? What it means for survival in this climate? Winters tried to regain control. The professor's enthusiasm is noted, but county regulations exist for a reason. We can't simply ignore proper procedures because something appears to work. Mitchell's voice took on a sharper edge. I'm not asking you to ignore procedures. I'm asking you to recognize competent engineering when you see it. If you want formal documentation, I'll provide it. I'll write a full technical report certifying the structural integrity of every wall I've examined. I'll submit it to your office, to the State Building Commission, to anyone who needs to see it. Will that satisfy your procedural requirements? The question hung in the cold air. Winters looked at Peterson, clearly uncertain how to proceed. The script they'd prepared hadn't included a credentialed professor willing to stake his professional reputation on a widow's stone walls. Peterson shifted tactics. Even if these specific walls are safe, what about the precedent? Do we want every settler building whatever they want without oversight? Where does it end? Catherine spoke before Mitchell could respond. Her voice carried clearly through the silent church. It ends with people learning to survive in a landscape that's been killing them for generations. It ends with children who stay healthy instead of sick all winter. It ends with families who can afford to stay on their land instead of being forced to sell because they can't keep warm. She pulled her own notebook from her pocket, the pages filled with weeks of careful observations. I've been recording data every day since my wall was completed. Interior temperature and exterior temperature, fuel consumption, even the health of my children compared to previous winters. The numbers don't lie, and neither do the families in this room who've built their own walls. Ask them if their children are warmer. Ask them if they're burning less wood. Ask them if they'd tear down these structures for $50 of debt forgiveness. Astrid Erickson stood, her voice fierce. My children were sick constantly last winter. This year, they've barely had a sniffle. Our house is warm enough that they can play instead of huddling under blankets. I don't care what the county says. I'm not destroying something that's keeping my family healthy. Pastor Johansson rose as well, his earlier uncertainty replaced by conviction. My own wall has been operating for 3 weeks. In that time, I've reduced my firewood consumption by half. As a man of God, I have to ask what kind of community destroys something that works, because it wasn't done according to proper paperwork. Isn't there a higher law than county regulations? More voices joined in, families describing warmer homes, healthier children, reduced fuel costs. The tide in the room had shifted, and Peterson could feel it slipping away from him. He made one final attempt. This is mob rule, not reasoned decision-making. Mr. Winters, you have the authority to issue citations regardless of what people here say. Winters looked at the faces surrounding him, at the professor, with his data at the families who'd found something that actually worked in a place where survival was never guaranteed. He was a bureaucrat, not a tyrant, and he could read the politics of the situation clearly enough. I'll need to review Professor Mitchell's technical report before making any final determinations. In the meantime, I'm not prepared to order demolitions of structures that a university professor has certified as safe. It wasn't a victory, but it was a retreat. Peterson's face went carefully blank, the mask of civic concern slipping to reveal the calculating merchant beneath. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, families clustering around Mitchell to ask questions, others discussing their own construction plans. Catherine found herself surrounded by neighbors who'd been uncertain an hour ago, but were now committed allies. Eric Haugen approached his wife beside him. "Mrs. Webb, I want to apologize. Peterson offered me money to speak against you tonight. I almost took it." Catherine shook her head. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself the chance to finish your wall before the worst cold hits." The church emptied slowly, families reluctant to return to their cold houses after experiencing the warmer atmosphere created by body heat and a single stove. Catherine remained until only Schmidt Mitchell and Pastor Johansson were left. Mitchell collapsed onto a pew exhausted. "I've never driven through a blizzard before. I don't recommend it, but your data was too compelling to ignore. The thermal efficiency you're achieving shouldn't be possible with such simple materials and techniques. It's forcing me to reconsider assumptions I've held about passive climate control." Schmidt clasped the younger man's shoulder. "Good engineering is good engineering, whether it comes from a university or a farmer's field." Eric understood that. So does Catherine. The question now is, what happens when Peterson regroups? Pastor Johansson looked troubled. "He won't forgive this. You've embarrassed him publicly, cost him whatever he was hoping to gain from forcing people to sell. Men like that don't simply accept defeat." Catherine had been thinking the same thing. Peterson's expression as he'd left the church had promised future action, not capitulation. He'd tried legal pressure, financial incentives, and public persuasion. All had failed, which meant his next move would be more desperate, more dangerous. Mitchell pulled a folded document from his satchel. "I brought something that might help. It's a letter of intent from the Great Northern Railway. They're planning to build 4 new stations along their northern route in areas with similar climate challenges. If your wall design works as well as your data suggests, they're prepared to pay $800 for detailed construction plans and consulting services." $800. The number echoed in Catherine's mind. It was more money than she'd seen in 5 years of marriage to Eric. Enough to secure her children's future pay for their education, establish real financial independence. But Mitchell wasn't finished. There's a condition. They want to see the walls perform through the worst of winter. They need proof that the design works not just in moderate cold, but in sustained extreme conditions. If we get the kind of deep freeze that kills livestock and freezes wells solid and your walls still maintain livable interior temperatures, then the deal is confirmed. Schmidt's weathered face creased into a grim smile. "Careful what you wish for, Professor. Dakota winters have a way of providing exactly the test you're asking for." The deep freeze arrived 4 days later. Catherine woke on February 8th to a silence that felt wrong. The usual wind sounds were absent, replaced by a stillness that seemed to press against the cabin walls. She went to the window and understood immediately. The thermometer read 32 degrees below zero, colder than she'd ever experienced. The sky was clear, stars still visible in the pre-dawn darkness, which meant no cloud cover to trap what little warmth the earth held. The cold was radiating up from the ground and down from the atmosphere, turning the air itself into something dense and hostile to life. She dressed quickly in layers of wool, checking on Lucas and Ingrid. Both children slept peacefully under single blankets, their breathing easy. The cabin's interior temperature had dropped to 52 degrees, the lowest it had been since the wall's completion, but still warmer than most houses achieved even with fires burning constantly. Schmidt appeared from his room already dressed. This is it, the real test. If the walls hold through this, they'll hold through anything. They spent the morning visiting each family that had built walls, carrying Mitchell's instruments to record precise temperature data. The professor had returned to Bismarck, but left his equipment with detailed instructions for its use. At each house, the story was similar: interior temperatures in the low 50s, children and adults functioning normally despite the lethal cold outside. At the Erickson farm, Gunnar was in his barn checking on livestock. Two of his cows had frozen water in their drinking trough despite being sheltered. But when they returned to the house, Astrid had coffee waiting, and the children were playing a board game near the stove, wearing normal indoor clothes. Gunnar's voice carried grudging amazement. It's colder outside than I've ever felt, the kind of cold that kills. But in here we're surviving, more than surviving. The contrast became stark when they passed houses without walls. Smoke poured from every chimney as families burned wood at desperate rates. Through windows, Catherine could see people huddled in coats and blankets, clustered as close to stoves as safety allowed. The Haugen house, with its half-finished wall, fell somewhere in between, warmer than the unprotected structures, but still requiring twice the fuel of a completed installation. By afternoon, word had spread through the settlement about the temperature readings Catherine was collecting. Families who'd been skeptical, who'd chosen Peterson's debt forgiveness over construction, now saw the consequences of their decision. Their houses were barely habitable, despite burning through firewood at catastrophic rates. One of them, a farmer named William Stokes, appeared at Catherine's door as evening approached. His face was raw from cold exposure, his hands shaking as much from desperation as temperature. "Mrs. Webb, I made a mistake. I took Peterson's money and tore down the wall I'd started building. Now I'm burning 3 cords of wood a week just to keep my family from freezing. At this rate, I'll be out of fuel by March. Is it too late to start again?" Catherine invited him inside, poured him coffee, laced with precious sugar to help warm him. "It's never too late, but building in this cold is difficult. The mortar won't cure properly. You'd be better off waiting for temperatures above 20 degrees. Stokes' shoulders sagged. "We might not last that long. My youngest daughter is already showing signs of frostbite on her feet. My wife is talking about moving in with her sister in Fargo, splitting up the family until spring." The desperation in his voice reflected a reality Catherine understood all too well. Survival wasn't guaranteed simply because you recognized your mistakes. Sometimes recognition came too late. Schmidt had been listening from across the room. "There's a temporary solution, not as effective as a proper wall, but better than nothing. We can build a wind deflector using wood frames and packed snow. It won't provide thermal mass, but it'll block the worst of the wind, reduce your heating needs by maybe 30%. It was a compromise, a band-aid on a serious wound, but Stokes seized it like a drowning man grabbing a rope. Over the next 3 days, Schmidt and a crew of volunteers built makeshift wind barriers for 5 families using whatever materials were available. The structures were crude compared to the stone walls, but they worked well enough to keep people alive. The deep freeze lasted 11 days. 11 days of temperatures that never rose above -20. 11 days of winds that turned exposed skin white with frostbite in under 5 minutes. 11 days that separated the settlement into clear categories. Those with proper walls who remained comfortable, those with partial protection, who struggled but survived, and those with nothing who burned through their resources at terrifying speed. Catherine maintained meticulous records throughout. Temperature readings every 4 hours, fuel consumption, tracked daily health observations noted for every family member. Mitchell had taught her to think like a scientist, and the data she collected would form the basis of his technical report to the railway company. But numbers couldn't capture everything. They couldn't record the sound of children laughing in a warm house while a killing cold raged outside. They couldn't measure the look on Astrid Eriksson's face when she realized her family was genuinely safe. They couldn't quantify the transformation in community dynamics as people who'd been skeptical became believers, as those who'd mocked became students. On February 19th, the temperature finally climbed to -5 degrees, and the settlement collectively exhaled. Families emerged from their houses to assess damage. 3 farms had lost livestock to the cold. 2 families had burned through all their firewood reserves and were now dependent on neighbors for fuel. But no one had died, no children had suffered serious frostbite, and the settlement as a whole had survived what old-timers were already calling the worst cold snap in 30 years. Mitchell returned on February 20th, traveling from Bismarck with a photographer and surveying equipment. He spent 3 days documenting the walls, interviewing families, collecting Catherine's data. His enthusiasm grew with each measurement. On his final evening, he gathered everyone at the church for a presentation. The building was packed again, but this time the atmosphere was celebration rather than confrontation. Mitchell had set up a large easel with technical drawings and data charts. "What you've accomplished here is unprecedented. I've consulted with colleagues at universities across the Midwest, shared your temperature data, described your construction techniques. The consensus is clear: you've developed the most effective passive climate control system for extreme cold that anyone has documented." He pointed to a chart showing comparative fuel consumption. Houses with complete thermal mass walls use an average of 32% of the firewood that unprotected structures required during the deep freeze. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a revolution in how we think about frontier construction. Gunnar raised his hand. "What does that mean practically, Professor? For us, I mean not for universities." Mitchell smiled. "It means the Great Northern Railway wanted us to hire Mrs. Webb as a consultant. It means your settlement is going to become famous in engineering circles. And it means that every family here has proven something important: intelligence and cooperation can triumph over even the most hostile environment." The applause was genuine, but Catherine noticed one significant absence. Harold Peterson hadn't attended. According to Pastor Johansson, he'd been in Bismarck for the past week on business. The timing seemed suspicious. Her instincts proved correct 2 days later. She was working in her barn sorting stones for a small retaining wall she planned to build come spring when Gunnar arrived at a run. His face was flushed with exertion and anger. "Catherine, you need to hear this. Peterson's back from Bismarck. He's telling everyone he's made a deal with a development company. They're planning to buy up properties in the settlement, tear down the existing structures, and build a proper town with brick buildings and modern amenities. He's offering twice market value for any family willing to sell." Catherine set down the stone she'd been examining. Who would sell? Everyone just proved their houses can handle the worst winter has to offer. Gunnar's expression darkened. Eric Haugen, William Stokes, 3 other families whose walls aren't finished or who never built at all. They're scared, Catherine. Scared of next winter, scared of debt, scared of being left behind if everyone else sells. Peterson's using that fear. The strategy was clever. Peterson couldn't attack the walls directly anymore, not after Mitchell's endorsement in the settlement's successful survival of the deep freeze. So instead, he was offering an escape route, promising something better than mere survival: modern houses with proper heating systems, financial security, an end to the constant struggle against climate and isolation. Schmidt had emerged from the cabin, overhearing the last part of the conversation. "How many families is he targeting?" "At least 7, maybe more. And here's the worst part: if enough people sell the settlement fragments, the families who stay won't have enough neighbors to maintain the church, the school, all the shared resources. Even those who don't want to sell might be forced to." It was a calculated dismantling. Peterson had learned from his previous failures. You couldn't fight success directly, but you could undermine the community that made success meaningful. Catherine made a decision. Gather everyone who's built walls or is in the process. Tonight at the church, we need to talk about what we're building here, and it's not just about stone and mortar anymore. That evening, 14 families assembled in the cold church. These were the committed ones, the families who'd invested labor and resources into Schmidt's teachings, who'd seen their children thrive in warm houses, who'd proven to themselves that intelligence could overcome adversity. Catherine stood before them, feeling the weight of responsibility. She wasn't a natural leader, had never sought authority or influence, but circumstance had placed her in this position, and she wouldn't shrink from it. Peterson is offering money and promises. He's targeting families who are struggling, who see his offer as salvation. I can't tell anyone what to do with their own property, but I can tell you what I think we're really deciding tonight. We're choosing between two different futures. One where we're dependent on outside companies and their promises, where our survival relies on their goodwill and profit margins. The other where we depend on ourselves, on what we've learned and built together. She paused, making eye contact with each family. The walls we've built aren't just stone. They're proof that we can solve our own problems, that we don't need to wait for salvation from Bismarck or Minneapolis or wherever Peterson's development company is based. We have knowledge now. We have skills. We have each other. That's worth more than twice market value for 40 acres of frozen prairie. Astrid Erickson spoke up. But what about the families who are genuinely struggling, who didn't finish their walls or who took Peterson's money earlier? Do we just abandon them? Schmidt stood, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. We help them, not out of charity, but because strong communities are built on mutual support. Any family who wants to build a wall, we teach them. Any family who needs assistance, we provide it. We create a settlement that's worth staying in, worth fighting for. The discussion continued for 2 hours, plans taking shape. They would form a cooperative, pooling resources to help families complete their walls before next winter. They would establish a formal school where Schmidt's techniques would be taught to the next generation. They would create agreements, ensuring that no one could sell to outside developers without community approval, protecting the settlement's integrity. It was ambitious, perhaps naive, but it offered an alternative to Peterson's vision of passive dependence on corporate benevolence. When the meeting adjourned, Catherine felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. They'd committed to something larger than individual survival. They were attempting to build a community based on shared knowledge and mutual support. A radical idea in a landscape that usually rewarded individual ambition and ruthless competition. Schmidt walked with her back to her cabin, Lucas and Ingrid drowsing between them. The night was clear and bitterly cold, though nothing compared to the deep freeze. Stars filled the sky in profusion impossible to see in cities, the Milky Way, a river of light overhead. You understand what you've started, don't you? This isn't just about buildings anymore. You're challenging the entire structure of how frontier settlements operate. Men like Peterson have built empires on controlling resources and credit. You're offering an alternative where communities control their own destiny. Catherine looked at her wall, black against the star-filled sky, solid and permanent. Eric started it. I'm just finishing what he began. The knowledge was always there in his journal and the stones he collected. I'm just the one who had to put it together. Schmidt's laugh was dry as winter wind. Don't diminish what you've done. Eric had vision, but you had the courage to execute it under circumstances that would have broken most people. You were a widow with 2 young children facing a hostile community and a winter that kills. You could have sold out, taken the easy path. Instead, you built something that's going to outlast all of us. They'd reached the cabin. Catherine could feel the warmth radiating from it. Even before opening the door, the thermal mass working exactly as Eric had designed, as she'd constructed, as Schmidt had refined. Inside, she tucked the children into bed, then sat at her table with Eric's journal open before her. She'd filled the remaining blank pages with her own notes, her observations and refinements. The book had become a collaboration across death. Eric's initial vision merged with her practical execution, creating something neither could have achieved alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Peterson wouldn't give up simply because one meeting hadn't gone his way. The development company he'd mentioned was real, backed by money and influence that dwarfed anything the settlement could muster. The fight was far from over. But tonight, in a warm house built by her own hands, according to principles that married ancient wisdom with modern physics, Catherine allowed herself to believe they might actually win. Spring arrived tentatively in late March, bringing temperatures that climbed above freezing during daylight hours before plunging back down at night. The freeze-thaw cycle turned roads into rivers of mud that could swallow a wagon wheel to the axle. Catherine stood in her doorway watching the snow retreat in patches, revealing brown grass in the dark earth beneath. Her firewood reserves, carefully rationed through the brutal winter, remained more than half intact. Across the fence line, she could see Gunnar Ericsson's woodpile reduced to scattered remnants, barely enough to last another week. The check from Great Northern Railway arrived on March 23rd, delivered by special courier from Bismarck. $800 in bank draft form, accompanied by a letter from Thomas Mitchell requesting detailed construction plans for 4 railway stations. Catherine held the paper, feeling its weight, both literal and symbolic. More money than Eric had earned in 3 years of mining. More money than her father had seen in his entire life as a school teacher. Lucas appeared at her elbow, reading over her shoulder with the improving literacy she'd been cultivating during long winter evenings. "Mama, that's a lot of money. What will we do with it?" She'd been considering that question for weeks, ever since Mitchell had first mentioned the railway's interest. The practical answer was simple: secure their future, invest in the farm, ensure her children had opportunities beyond scratching survival from frozen soil. But practicality competed with obligation. The settlement had supported her, defended her walls when Peterson tried to tear them down, stood with her against county bureaucrats and financial pressure. "First, we're going to pay Johann Schmidt for his time and expertise. Then we're going to establish a fund to help families finish their walls before next winter. The rest goes into savings for your and Ingrid's education." Schmidt, overhearing from his workspace near the stove, where he was sketching plans for the railway stations, waved a dismissive hand. "I don't need payment. I came here because Eric was like a son to me. Teaching his widow and helping this settlement was its own reward." Catherine crossed the room, placed $300 in gold certificates on the table beside his drawings. "Eric would have wanted you compensated fairly, and I won't build my children's future on unpaid labor, no matter how generously offered." The old stonemason stared at the money for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your husband chose well when he married you. You have his stubbornness, but also his integrity." News of the railway contract spread through the settlement, within hours carried on the informal network of farm wives who visited each other during mud season when fieldwork was impossible. Catherine had expected congratulations, perhaps some envy. What she didn't anticipate was the delegation that appeared at her door 2 days later. 7 men, including Gunnar Ericsson and Pastor Johansson, requested a formal meeting. Their expressions carried a mixture of hope and desperation that made Catherine's stomach tighten with apprehension. Pastor Johansson spoke for the group, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone navigating difficult waters. "Mrs. Webb, we've come to make a proposal. The cooperative we discussed in February, the plan to help families complete their walls, we'd like to make it official. With your railway money as seed capital and Johann's expertise, we could establish a proper construction enterprise. Families pay what they can afford, those who can't pay contribute labor, and we all benefit from shared knowledge." It was a reasonable idea, even noble in its way. But Catherine heard the unspoken subtext. They wanted her to risk her newfound financial security to subsidize community infrastructure. If the enterprise failed, she'd lose her investment. If it succeeded, the benefits would be distributed collectively while she bore the initial risk alone. Gunnar's voice carried the bluntness she'd come to expect from him. "We understand what we're asking. You've earned that money through your own work and risk. But we're also asking you to consider what happens if this settlement fractures. Peterson is still out there, still offering deals to families who are desperate. If we don't create something worth staying for, we'll lose half our neighbors by summer." Catherine looked at the faces before her, seeing the complex calculus of survival and community etched in weathered features. These were men who'd mocked her 6 months ago, who predicted her failure, who'd considered her an example of feminine foolishness. Now they stood in her home hats, literally in hands, asking her to save them. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the genuine need. I'll contribute $200 to a community fund administered by Pastor Johansson, with oversight from a committee that includes at least 2 women. The money is for materials and emergency assistance only. Labor must be provided by families themselves or traded within the community. And any family that takes Peterson's offer after receiving assistance from this fund must repay the full amount. We help those who help themselves, not those looking for handouts. The terms were harder than what they'd hoped for, but fair enough that no one could object without seeming unreasonable. After brief consultation among themselves, the men agreed. But Gunnar had one more request. There's another matter. William Stokes came to me yesterday. He's in bad shape. Burned through all his wood during the deep freeze borrowed from 3 different neighbors to make it through March. Now he owes more than he can repay, and Peterson is circling. I think we need to make him the first test of this cooperative. Build his wall properly, prove the system works. Catherine considered William Stokes a weak man who'd made poor choices, who'd taken Peterson's money and demolished his partially completed wall, who'd spent the winter suffering the consequences of that decision. Part of her felt he deserved his predicament, but another part, the part that remembered her own desperation in October, recognized that survival sometimes required helping people who'd failed to help themselves. Agreed, but Stokes provides half the labor himself and his family contributes the rest. We're not building it for him, we're teaching him to build it himself. Over the next 6 weeks, the Stokes wall took shape as a community project. Different families contributed specific expertise. The Ericsons handled stone selection and transport, the Bergmans mixed mortar. Pastor Johansson supervised foundation work. Catherine and Schmidt provided technical guidance, but they insisted William and his teenage sons do the actual construction under supervision. The process transformed William Stokes. The first week he worked with the sullen reluctance of a man doing penance. By the 3rd week, his movements had gained confidence. His questions showed genuine understanding. By the time the wall reached its full height in late May, he could explain thermal mass principles to curious neighbors with the enthusiasm of a convert. But the project's success created an unexpected problem. 3 more families requested similar assistance, then 5 more. The cooperative fund, generous when established, couldn't possibly cover materials for 8 major construction projects. Catherine called an emergency meeting of the Oversight Committee, which now included herself, Pastor Johansson, Astrid Erickson, and a practical-minded farmer's wife named Helen Bergman. They gathered in the church vestry, account books spread across a scarred wooden table. Helen's assessment was blunt. We have enough funds for 2 more complete walls, maybe 3, if families can source some materials themselves. After that, we're depleted unless we find new revenue. Astrid looked troubled. We can't tell families we'll help them survive and then abandon them halfway through. That's worse than never offering help at all. Pastor Johansson cleared his throat. There might be another option. I've been corresponding with a colleague in Fargo. He mentioned that the state agriculture department has a new program providing grants for innovative farming techniques that improve winter survivability. These walls certainly qualify. Catherine felt a flicker of hope. How much money are we talking about? Potentially up to $500 for a settlement that can demonstrate measurable improvements in winter survival rates. But the application process is competitive, and we'd need documentation, testimonials, technical specifications. It was Catherine's area of expertise. She'd been maintaining meticulous records since October: temperature, data fuel consumption rates, health outcomes, construction costs. Combined with Mitchell's engineering report and testimonials from families, they had everything needed for a compelling application. She spent 3 days drafting the proposal, working late into spring evenings, while Schmidt reviewed technical sections and Pastor Johansson polished the prose. The final document ran to 42 pages, including detailed diagrams, cost-benefit analyses, and signed statements from every family that had built walls. The application went to Fargo by courier on June 2nd. The response arrived July 15th, declined. The rejection letter was professionally courteous but final. The agriculture department appreciated the settlement's innovation, but couldn't justify funding construction projects that weren't directly related to crop production. Stone walls, however effective for climate control, fell outside their mandate. Catherine read the letter 3 times, feeling each polite phrase like a physical blow. They'd been counting on that money. Families had delayed construction waiting for official approval before committing to projects they couldn't afford to abandon halfway. Schmidt found her that evening sitting on her porch, the rejection letter crumpled beside her. He lowered himself onto the step with a grunt, his joints protesting the movement. Bureaucrats always find reasons to say no. It's safer than saying yes. Catherine's laugh was bitter. We needed that money. We promised the families we'd help them. Now what do we tell them? The old stonemason was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of amber and rose. You tell them the truth, that institutions failed them, as institutions usually do. But that doesn't mean hope is lost. It just means we have to be more creative. His words triggered a memory of something Thomas Mitchell had mentioned during his last visit. The professor had been talking about academic publishing, about journals that paid for groundbreaking research papers. Catherine had dismissed it at the time, focused on immediate practical concerns. But now the idea returned with new urgency. She spent the next week converting her meticulous winter records into a formal research paper written in the technical language Mitchell had taught her. The title alone took hours to perfect: Passive Thermal Management in Extreme Cold Climates, a practical application of thermal mass and wind deflection principles in North Dakota homesteads, 1923 to 1924. Mitchell, when she sent him the draft, responded with enthusiasm bordering on disbelief. His letter arrived 10 days later, covered in marginal notes and suggestions, but fundamentally supportive. The journal he recommended, Engineering Quarterly, paid $50 for accepted papers and reached an audience of architects, engineers, and builders across the northern United States. The paper was accepted in August with publication scheduled for the October issue. $50 was nowhere near the $500 they'd hoped for, but Mitchell's cover letter contained something potentially more valuable. A list of 12 architecture firms from Chicago to Seattle that had contacted him requesting information about Catherine's wall designs after hearing rumors through professional networks. Each of these firms is working on projects in cold climates. If even half of them hire you for consulting work, at standard rates you're looking at significantly more than any government grant would have provided. The trick is convincing them to take a widow from North Dakota seriously. Catherine showed the letter to Schmidt, who studied the list with calculating eyes. This could work, but you need more than data. You need to demonstrate expertise in person, convince these firms you are not just someone who got lucky with one good design. How do I do that when I've never left North Dakota? Schmidt's smile was wolfish. You build something impressive enough that they come to you. Something that makes your settlement famous, that proves beyond doubt you understand principles they only read about in textbooks. The idea took shape over the following weeks as summer heat replaced spring mud. They would construct a demonstration building at the edge of the settlement, something that showcased every thermal management technique they developed. Not just a wall, but an entire structure designed as a living laboratory where temperature, humidity, and airflow could be precisely controlled and measured. The building would serve multiple purposes: a school where Schmidt's techniques could be taught, a meeting hall for community gatherings, and a proof of concept for potential clients. Most importantly, it would be built entirely by settlement labor, using local materials, demonstrating that sophisticated engineering didn't require urban resources or expensive imported components. Catherine presented the plan at a community meeting in late August. The response was mixed. Some families embraced it immediately, seeing the potential for putting their settlement on the map. Others worried about the labor investment, the time taken from farming and preparation for the coming winter. Harold Peterson, attending his first community meeting in months, stood to voice opposition. He'd been quiet since his February defeat, focusing on his store and whatever schemes he pursued in Bismarck. But the demonstration building proposal drew him back into public conflict. This is exactly the kind of grandiose thinking that leads to disaster. We're farmers and merchants, not architects, building fancy demonstration halls when we should be harvesting crops and preparing for winter. It's foolishness dressed up as progress. Catherine met his gaze across the crowded room. Last winter, families with proper walls survived the worst cold in 30 years while using a third of the fuel. That wasn't foolishness. That was engineering. This building will teach those same principles to a wider audience, bringing attention and resources to our settlement. Unless you prefer, we remain isolated and dependent on whatever terms outside merchants choose to offer. The jab at Peterson's control through his store monopoly landed hard. His face flushed, but before he could respond, Gunner stood. I'll contribute 2 weeks of labor. My sons will contribute another week. This building represents our future, and I'm tired of being told we should know our place and accept limitations. Other voices joined in pledging time and effort. Within an hour, they had commitments for enough labor to complete the project before first snow. Peterson left the meeting early, his expression promising future trouble. Construction began September 1st. The site chosen was a slight rise at the intersection of two main roads visible from miles away across the flat prairie. The building would be 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, with walls 8 feet high, constructed entirely of stone. Unlike the residential walls that protected existing structures, this would be a freestanding building with sophisticated features, adjustable vents for controlling airflow, a double-wall design that created insulating air pockets, a roof system that captured and redirected solar heat. Schmidt supervised the foundation work with exacting standards. This will be photographed, studied, maybe even featured in architectural journals. Every stone must be perfect, every angle precise. We're not just building for ourselves anymore. We're building for everyone who sees this and decides whether to take us seriously. Catherine worked alongside settlement members, her hands returning to the familiar rhythm of selecting stones, mixing mortar, placing each piece with careful attention to weight distribution and thermal properties. Lucas and Ingrid, now seasoned assistants, taught younger children the basics, while adults handled heavier work. The project transformed the settlement's dynamics in unexpected ways. Women contributed equally to men, their smaller hands often better suited for detail work around vents and joints. Children became integral parts of construction teams rather than obstacles to be managed. Elderly members too frail for heavy lifting served as quality inspectors, their experienced eyes catching mistakes before they became structural problems. By mid-September, the walls reached their full height. The structure dominated the landscape, its curves and angles catching sunlight in ways that made it seem almost alive. Travelers on the road stopped to stare, some asking questions about the unusual building. Word spread to neighboring settlements, to Bismarck, eventually to Fargo and beyond. Thomas Mitchell arrived unannounced on September 28th, bringing 2 colleagues from the university and a photographer with expensive equipment. They spent 3 days documenting every aspect of the building, taking measurements, conducting interviews, filling notebooks with observations. Mitchell pulled Catherine aside on the final day, his expression serious. I've been corresponding with an architectural firm in Minneapolis. They're designing a hospital for International Falls right on the Canadian border. Winters there make North Dakota look temperate. They need someone who understands passive climate control at a practical level, not just theoretical. The job pays $300 plus expenses for 3 months of consulting work. $300 for 3 months was more than most settlers earned in a year. But it would mean leaving the farm, leaving Lucas and Ingrid, traveling to a city where she knew no one. When would they need me? Mitchell's hesitation told her everything. They start construction in November. They need you there by October 20th to finalize plans before the ground freezes. October 20th was 3 weeks away. Barely enough time to arrange affairs, ensure the farm was secure for winter, make provisions for her children's care. The timing was terrible, the disruption enormous. But the opportunity was unprecedented. A chance to work on a major institutional building, to prove her expertise beyond the settlement's boundaries, to establish credentials that would open doors for years to come. Schmidt appeared beside her, having overheard the conversation. Lucas and Ingrid can stay with me. Astrid Erickson has already offered to help with cooking and daily care. Your farm will be tended by the same community you have been supporting. Go do this work, Catherine. Show them what a North Dakota widow can accomplish. The decision crystallized. Tell the firm I accept. I'll arrive in Minneapolis by October 18th. Mitchell's grin was triumphant. There's a train from Bismarck twice a week. I'll arrange tickets and send detailed information about the firm and the project. This is going to change everything, Catherine. You understand that, right? Success on this hospital means more work, bigger projects, national recognition. She understood. She also understood the risks. Failure would confirm every prejudice about women lacking the capacity for serious engineering work. Success would mark her as an exception, but also a threat to men who saw architecture and construction as exclusively masculine domains. But fear of failure had never stopped her before. The next 2 weeks passed in frantic preparation. Catherine compiled her notebooks into organized portfolios, created detailed drawings of every successful wall design, wrote instructions for her children's care with obsessive thoroughness. Schmidt would live in her cabin during her absence, maintaining the property and ensuring Lucas and Ingrid attended school consistently. Saying goodbye to her children the morning of October 17th was harder than she'd anticipated. Ingrid clung to her skirts, crying despite Catherine's attempts at reassurance. Lucas tried to be brave, his 9-year-old face set in determined lines that reminded her painfully of Eric. Mama, you'll come back, won't you? You won't stay in the city and forget about us. She knelt to his level, gripping his shoulders firmly. I could never forget you. I'm doing this so you and your sister can have opportunities I never had. Education choices, futures that aren't limited by what other people think you're capable of. But this is still your home, and I'm still your mother. Nothing changes that. Schmidt drove her to Bismarck in his wagon, the journey taking most of the day across roads that alternated between passable and treacherous. They barely spoke, the old stonemason respecting her need for silence as she mentally prepared for what lay ahead. The train station in Bismarck was the largest building Catherine had ever entered, its high ceilings and echoing spaces intimidating after months of frontier simplicity. Mitchell had sent detailed instructions and tickets, but navigating the crowds and finding the correct platform required assistance from harried railway employees. The train itself was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Catherine had never traveled faster than a horse could pull a wagon. The speed of the locomotive, the way the landscape blurred past the windows, the thunderous noise and acrid coal smoke all combined to make her feel unmoored from everything familiar. Minneapolis appeared on the afternoon of October 18th, a sprawling city of brick and stone that made Bismarck seem like a village. Catherine stepped onto the platform carrying one small trunk of belongings and a leather satchel containing her notebooks and drawings. The crowd was overwhelming, hundreds of people moving with purposeful urgency, vendors shouting whistles, shrieking the smell of coal smoke and humanity thick in the air. A man in a dark suit stood near the platform's edge, holding a hand-lettered sign, Mrs. Catherine Webb. She approached cautiously. I'm Catherine Webb. He extended a hand, his handshake firm but not crushing. James Hartford, junior partner at Hartford & Sons Architecture. Professor Mitchell sent a telegram saying you had arrived today. We've arranged lodging at a respectable boarding house, and Mr. Hartford Sr. would like to meet with you first thing tomorrow morning. The boarding house was clean but sparse, a narrow room with a single bed and a small desk. The landlady, a severe woman named Mrs. Paulson, explained the rules: no male visitors, breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, absolutely no cooking in rooms. Catherine unpacked her few belongings, hung her 2 dresses in the tiny closet, and sat at the desk, staring at her notebooks. Tomorrow she would meet with the architects who trained at prestigious universities, who designed buildings across the Midwest, who had every reason to dismiss a frontier widow as unqualified for serious work. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her, making sleep impossible, despite the exhaustion of travel. She opened her journal, the one Eric had started, and she'd continued and read his final message: "Don't let them take what's ours." The words applied to more than land. They applied to knowledge, to dignity, to the right to be taken seriously regardless of gender or origin. When sleep finally came, she dreamed of stone walls rising against winter wind, of children playing in warm houses, of a settlement that had learned to thrive in a landscape designed to kill. The Hartford and Sons office occupied the third floor of a modern building downtown. Catherine arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, her best dress, pressed her leather satchel containing everything she'd accomplished over the past year. The receptionist, a young woman with fashionable bobbed hair, looked her over with barely concealed condescension. "You're here about the cleaning position." Catherine kept her voice level. "I'm here to meet with Mr. Hartford about the International Falls Hospital project. I'm the thermal engineering consultant." The receptionist's expression shifted from condescension to confusion to embarrassment in rapid succession. She disappeared into an inner office, returning moments later with instructions to follow. Charles Hartford was 60, with silver hair and the expensive suit of a successful professional. He stood when Catherine entered, his eyes assessing her with the same careful attention she'd seen Schmidt apply to questionable stones. "Mrs. Webb, Professor Mitchell speaks highly of your work. I confess I'm curious about these thermal management techniques you've developed. Most architects address cold climate challenges through mechanical heating systems, not passive design." Catherine set her satchel on his desk, extracting the portfolio she'd prepared. "Mechanical systems fail, fuel runs out. Passive systems work regardless of external resources or supply chains. That's especially important for a hospital that can't afford to lose heat during critical procedures or patient care." She spread her drawings across his desk, technical diagrams of her walls, temperature data from the deep freeze photographs of the demonstration building, calculations showing fuel consumption reductions. Hartford studied each document with increasing interest, his questions growing more technical and engaged. After 2 hours, he leaned back in his chair. "This is impressive work, genuinely innovative. But I need to be frank with you, Mrs. Webb. This firm has never hired a woman for anything beyond secretarial work. Our clients are conservative, our contractors are skeptical of new approaches, and your presence on this project will raise questions and objections." Catherine had anticipated this. What matters more, their comfort or the hospital's performance? If you build using conventional methods, you'll create a structure that requires constant fuel, vulnerable to supply disruptions, expensive to operate. If you implement my designs, you'll have a building that maintains stable temperatures regardless of external conditions, saves thousands of dollars annually in heating costs, and demonstrates cutting-edge engineering. Which would you prefer, to put your firm's reputation behind? Hartford's smile was slow but genuine. "Professor Mitchell warned me you were formidable." He undersold it. "All right, Mrs. Webb. 3-month contract, $300. You'll work directly with our senior engineer to integrate your thermal management system into the hospital design. But understand, if this fails, if your techniques don't perform as promised, the damage to both our reputations will be severe." The first month in Minneapolis tested Catherine in ways the North Dakota winter never had. The architectural firm's senior engineer, Robert Morrison, made his skepticism clear from day one. He questioned every specification, challenged every calculation, demanded proof for assertions that would have been accepted without question from a male colleague. Catherine responded with data. For every question, she provided measurements, temperature readings, photographic evidence. When Morrison claimed her ventilation calculations were wrong, she walked him through the mathematics step by step until he had to acknowledge the accuracy. When he suggested her stonewall designs were impractical for institutional construction, she produced letters from families describing year-long performance. The work consumed 14-hour days. Catherine would spend mornings at the firm, afternoons at the construction site where the hospital's foundation was being prepared, evenings in her boarding house room, refining drawings and specifications. She wrote letters to Lucas and Ingrid every night describing the city and the work. in terms they could understand, maintaining the connection across hundreds of miles. By mid-November, Morrison's resistance had shifted to grudging respect. The hospital's heating system, as modified by Catherine's designs, would use 40% less coal than comparable buildings while maintaining more stable temperatures. The walls incorporated thermal mass principles scaled up for institutional use. The ventilation system created natural airflow that would reduce disease transmission, a critical feature for a facility treating infectious patients. But the real test came when Harold Peterson appeared in Minneapolis. Catherine was working late at the construction site reviewing foundation work before winter, made further excavation impossible when Peterson stepped out of the shadows near the equipment shed. His presence in Minneapolis, hundreds of miles from the settlement, sent immediate alarm through her system. Mrs. Webb, impressive project you've got here, quite a step up from stacking rocks around frontier cabins. She kept her voice neutral, refusing to show the fear his unexpected appearance triggered. Mr. Peterson, this is a long way from North Dakota. What brings you to Minneapolis? His smile was cold calculation. Business. I've been expanding my interests, establishing connections with suppliers and developers in larger markets. Happened to hear about this hospital project about the famous thermal engineer from our little settlement. Thought I'd see for myself what all the attention was about. The threat wasn't explicit, but Catherine heard it clearly. Peterson had come to undermine her, to spread doubts about her qualifications or reliability, to sabotage the project that was establishing her professional reputation. The work speaks for itself. If you'll excuse me, I have calculations to complete before the morning meeting. Peterson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone meant to sound reasonable to any possible observers. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to return to the settlement by month's end. You're going to recommend that families use my store exclusively for building materials. And you're going to convince your cooperative to dissolve, ending this foolish competition with established business. In exchange, I'll forget about the various irregularities in your work here. Catherine's hands clenched at her sides. What irregularities? Oh, I'm sure I can find some if I look hard enough. Questions about your qualifications, your education, whether you're really the one doing the technical work or just taking credit for men's designs. Academic fraud is a serious accusation, Mrs. Webb. Even the appearance of it could destroy your career before it begins. The calculation was elegant in its cruelty. Peterson couldn't attack her directly anymore, not after her public successes, but he could plant doubts, spread rumors, create enough smoke that clients would question whether hiring her was worth the controversy. She met his eyes, seeing the same petty tyranny that had tried to force her off her land, that had attempted to tear down her wall, that had used debt as a weapon against struggling families. No. The word came out flat and final. Peterson's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. I have connections in this city, investors who listen when I raise concerns. One word from me in this project faces delays, inspections, regulatory scrutiny that could drag on for months. Your reputation won't survive it. Catherine felt something crystallize inside her, a hardness forged through months of survival and struggle. Then do it. Raise your concerns, use your connections, deploy whatever weapons you think will work. Because I'm not negotiating with you anymore, Mr. Peterson. I'm done pretending your threats have power over me. You tried to steal my land, and I kept it. You tried to destroy my wall, and it's still standing. You tried to break the settlement's cooperative, and it's stronger than ever. What makes you think threats will work now when they've failed every other time? Peterson's face had gone red, his carefully maintained composure cracking. You arrogant woman! You think because you've had some success with country projects, you can compete in real business? I'll destroy you. I'll make sure no one in the Midwest hires you for anything more complex than a chicken coop. Then start trying, because I have work to do and you're wasting my time. She turned and walked away, half expecting him to follow, to escalate the confrontation. Instead, she heard his footsteps retreating, fading into the Minneapolis night. Her hands shook as she returned to her calculations, adrenaline making the numbers blur on the page. Peterson's threats weren't empty bluster. He did have connections, resources, the ability to cause serious problems. But giving in would mean surrendering everything she'd built, reducing herself to dependence on his mercy and goodwill. The next morning, she met with Charles Hartford in his office and told him everything: Peterson's appearance, his threats, the history of conflict back in the settlement. Hartford listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his telephone, was showing the operator to connect him to the State Board of Architecture. "This is Charles Hartford. I need to report an attempt at professional intimidation and possible fraud. A merchant named Harold Peterson has been making threats against one of my consultants, claiming he can manufacture regulatory problems for our hospital project unless she agrees to certain business arrangements." Catherine listened as Hartford methodically documented Peterson's threats, creating an official record that would make any future accusations appear as retaliation rather than legitimate concerns. When he hung up, his expression was grim but satisfied. Men like Peterson thrive in shadows, using implied threats and backroom pressure. Drag their tactics into daylight and they lose power. I've also contacted 3 of my clients who use Peterson's supply company. They'll be reviewing their contracts with new scrutiny. If he's willing to use coercion against you, he's likely done it to others. The hospital project was completed on December 15th, 3 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget. The final inspections confirmed what Catherine's calculations had predicted: the building maintained stable interior temperatures using 60% less fuel than comparable structures. The architect overseeing final review, a stern man from the state capitol, spent 2 hours examining the thermal management systems before grudgingly admitting they exceeded all requirements. Charles Hartford presented Catherine with her final payment, along with a bonus for early completion, and a letter of recommendation so glowing it bordered on embarrassing. "We have 3 more projects lined up that need cold climate expertise. If you're willing, we'd like to retain you as a permanent consultant at $500 annually plus project fees." $500 annually was wealth beyond anything Catherine had imagined. But it would mean regular travel, extended absences from the settlement, and her children immersion in a professional world that still viewed women as anomalies at best. She requested time to consider, then boarded the train back to North Dakota on December 17th. The settlement had changed in her absence. The demonstration building stood complete, a testament to collective labor and shared vision. 3 more families had finished walls using the cooperative fund. The school Johann Schmidt had envisioned was operating out of the demonstration building, teaching construction techniques to anyone interested. Lucas and Ingrid met her at the wagon when Schmidt drove her home from Bismarck. Both children had grown in 3 months, their faces more mature, their questions more sophisticated. They told her about lessons with Schmidt, about helping neighbors with construction projects, about the way the settlement had rallied together through early winter storms. The farm looked exactly as she'd left it, maintained with the same care she would have provided herself. Schmidt had even improved the barn's ventilation using principles from her hospital work, creating better air circulation for the livestock. That evening, after the children were asleep, Catherine sat with Schmidt on her porch, despite the December cold. The wall radiated stored heat, making the space comfortable enough for conversation. "The settlement doesn't need me the way it did 6 months ago. You've taught them everything I could teach and more. They're self-sufficient now, building their own walls, solving their own problems." Schmidt's voice was gentle. "They don't need you to survive, but they need you to thrive, to remember that excellence is possible even in difficult circumstances. You're proof that knowledge and determination can overcome any obstacle. That's worth more than technical expertise." Catherine thought about the Minneapolis offer, about the children who needed stability, about the settlement that had supported her when she had nothing. "If I take the consulting work, I'd be gone months at a time. Lucas and Ingrid would grow up with an absent mother, raised by neighbors and friends, however kind. Is professional success worth that sacrifice?" The old stonemason was quiet for a long time, watching stars emerge in the winter sky. Eric used to ask similar questions. Whether knowledge was worth the risk he took in mines, whether providing for his family justified time away from them. He never found a perfect answer because there isn't one. You make the best choice you can with the information you have, and you live with the consequences. The answer came to Catherine fully formed on Christmas morning. She would accept Hartford's consulting offer, but on modified terms, 3 projects annually, instead of continuous work, all scheduled between October and March, when farm work was minimal with clear boundaries about time away from the settlement. It wasn't perfect, but it balanced professional opportunity against family responsibility in a way she could live with. She wrote to Hartford that afternoon outlining her counterproposal. His response arrived 10 days later, accepted along with details of the first project starting in October 1925. January brought the coldest temperatures since the previous year's deep freeze, but this time the settlement was prepared. Every family had completed walls, fuel reserves were adequate, and the cooperative fund had enough surplus to help 2 families who'd suffered barn fires and needed emergency assistance. Harold Peterson's store remained open, but his monopoly was broken. A farmers' cooperative had formed pooling resources to buy supplies wholesale from Bismarck and splitting costs among members. Peterson's prices dropped to compete his profits, shrinking his influence over the settlement, diminishing to mere commerce rather than control. Catherine heard through informal networks that his Minneapolis connections had evaporated after Hartford's interventions. Several suppliers had discovered Peterson had been inflating invoices and pocketing the difference, of fraud that cost him business relationships and legal trouble. On February 8th, exactly 1 year after the deep freeze that had tested her walls so thoroughly, catastrophe struck Peterson in a way no one anticipated. He'd been building his own wall behind his store, working alone without consulting Schmidt or following proper techniques. The structure was purely aesthetic, meant to demonstrate that he too could master the technology that had made Catherine famous. But Peterson had skipped a foundation work, built too high without adequate base width, used insufficient mortar between stones. The collapse happened during a warm spell when freeze-thaw cycles made the ground unstable. 6 feet of stone came down in seconds, catching Peterson beneath. His legs were crushed bones, shattered beyond any hope of setting properly in a frontier settlement without advanced medical care. Catherine heard about the accident from Pastor Johansson, who came to her house 2 hours after it happened. He's asking for you. I don't know why, but he specifically requested that you come. She found Peterson in his own bed, pale from blood loss and shock, his legs immobilized in makeshift splints. The local doctor, a practical man with limited training, stood nearby looking grim. Gangrene will set in within days if we don't amputate. Maybe both legs, certainly the left. Even then, infection could spread. His chances aren't good. Peterson's eyes tracked to Catherine as she entered. His voice was weak, stripped of the arrogance she'd always associated with him. I built the wall wrong. Tried to save money, skipped steps, thought I knew better than the Germans' instructions. Pride and stupidity. Catherine pulled a chair beside the bed, her feelings complicated. This man had tried to destroy her, had threatened her children, had attempted to break the settlement's cooperative spirit. But seeing him broken and dying, she felt only pity. Why did you ask for me? His laugh was bitter. Because you're the one person who might understand. I've spent years building an empire on control and leverage, making myself indispensable, so people needed me. You built something on knowledge and cooperation, making yourself irrelevant by teaching others everything you knew. My way left me here alone, dying because I couldn't admit I didn't understand something. Your way created a settlement that thrives without you. I wanted to tell you I was wrong about everything. The admission hung in the air between them. Catherine thought about the easy cruelty of saying, I told you so, about the satisfaction of watching an enemy face consequences. But she'd learned from Eric, from Schmidt, from a year of building walls, that the point wasn't victory over others. The point was survival and community. There's a hospital in Minneapolis using techniques I helped design, advanced care surgical procedures beyond what's available here. If you're willing to go, I can send a telegram requesting they accept you as a patient. It'll cost money, but you might save your legs, possibly your life. Peterson stared at her, disbelief and confusion warring on his face. Why would you help me after everything I did to you? Catherine stood preparing to leave. Because spite and revenge don't keep anyone warm in winter. Because I'd rather live in a settlement where even our enemies can change than one where past wrongs define future possibilities. And because my children are watching how I respond to this learning, whether mercy is weakness or strength. She sent the telegram that afternoon. The hospital accepted Peterson as a patient, and he was transported to Minneapolis within 2 days. His survival wasn't certain, but he had a chance he wouldn't have had in the settlement. His son, a young man of 19 who'd been running the store in his father's growing absence, approached Catherine a week later. I don't understand why you helped him. He was terrible to you. Catherine was working on drawings for her next consulting project, technical specifications for a school in northern Wisconsin. She set down her pencil. Your father and I were fighting over scraps, acting like survival was a competition where someone had to lose. But the real enemy was never each other. It was the cold, the isolation, the systems that kept us all struggling. When you understand that helping even your enemies makes strategic sense. The young Peterson nodded slowly. He wrote me a letter from the hospital, said when he recovers, he wants to sell the store to the farmers cooperative at a fair price. Said he's tired of fighting battles that don't matter. The winter of 1925 to 26 passed quietly, almost anticlimactic after the previous year's drama. The farmers cooperative purchased Peterson's store at the fair price his son had promised, transforming it into a community resource rather than a tool of control. Schmidt remained through spring training, a new generation of builders, before finally returning to his own farm in Fargo, satisfied that his knowledge would outlive him. Catherine took 2 consulting projects that winter, each one building her reputation further, but she always returned home between assignments drawn by the laughter of children playing in warm houses, by the sight of stone walls standing firm against Dakota storms. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal. The settlement had survived, another winter had grown stronger through cooperation and shared knowledge. Catherine's consulting work provided steady income while allowing her to remain grounded in the community that had become her true home. On a warm day in late April 1926, she stood on the rise where the demonstration building dominated the landscape. Lucas and Ingrid played nearby, their laughter carrying on the wind. Johann Schmidt had left behind a school that continued to thrive, teaching his techniques to students from neighboring settlements. Thomas Mitchell had written to say her Engineering Quarterly article had generated unprecedented interest. 7 universities wanted to study her techniques. 12 architectural firms had requested consultations. A publisher in Chicago wanted to commission a book about frontier thermal management. But what mattered most was visible from that rise: a settlement of warm houses, healthy families, children playing instead of shivering, a community that had learned to thrive in a landscape designed to kill. Eric's wall, the one she'd completed in grief and desperation, still stood at the edge of her property. But it was no longer unique. The settlement was surrounded by stone curves, by structures that married ancient wisdom with modern physics, by proof that intelligence and cooperation could transform even the most hostile environment into something survivable. Catherine Webb had come to North Dakota as a grieving widow with 2 children and no prospects. She'd leave eventually, drawn by professional opportunities in distant cities. But she'd always return because this settlement represented something more valuable than money or recognition. It represented the truth that human beings, working together with knowledge and determination, could build futures that seemed impossible. The smartest people weren't those who conquered nature. They were the ones who learned to partner with it.